Freedom, Black August Resistance, everyone. Peace, everybody. Thank you all for being here today for our Tip of the Spear conversation with Orisanmi Burton, a conversation about the Shut Down Attica campaign and the prison resistance struggle. My name is Naima Akinwole Bandele. I'm just doing the introductions today. I'm from the New York chapter of the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. The Malcolm X Grassroots Movement is an organization of Black New Africans whose mission is to defend the human rights of our people and promote self-determination in our communities. We understand that the collective institutions of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism have been at the root of our people's oppression, and we understand that without community control and without the power to determine our own lives, we will continue to fall victim to genocide. Thus, we fight for power and community control. And so today we're going to gather and engage in a conversation with Alan Tapal from the New York MXGM chapter, Lumumba Akinwole Bandele from the New York chapter, and author Orisanmi Burton of Tip of the Spear. Focuses on the conditions that contributed to the Attica Uprising in 1971. We're going to learn about what were the local, domestic, and international dynamics that impacted these conditions. And so, you know, this is the month of Black August. So this is why we do. Peace, everybody. This is a month-long commemoration to honor the fallen freedom fighters of the Black Liberation Movement, to call for the release of political prisoners and prisoners of war, and to educate our people on the history of continued resistance of Black New African peoples, oppression, colonization, and slavery in the US and throughout the diaspora. So we're going to start off with a short 5-minute clip about the Attica Uprising in 1971. So give us a moment to bring the video up.
We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such. What has happened here is but the sound before the fury of those who are oppressed. These words were spoken during the 1971 Attica Prison Rebellion by one of its leaders, Elliot Barkley. At the time, Attica Prison was severely overcrowded. Its majority Black and Latino population faced constant physical and verbal abuse. All prison guards were white. Some were members of white supremacist hate groups. Guards threw away letters that weren't written in English and prohibited Muslim religious services. They punished white prisoners for fraternizing with non-white men. Prisoners were allowed 1 shower a week and 1 roll of toilet paper a month. Among those imprisoned at Attica were Elliot Barkley, Frank Smith, and Herbert X. Blyden. "I'm dying here little by little every day," Barkley wrote his mother. She contacted authorities, but nothing changed. He began writing a book about life at Attica. Meanwhile, Smith worked a position called the Warden's Laundry Boy for 30 cents a day. His grandmother had been enslaved. Because Smith and others were treated as less than human at the will of their keepers, they viewed prison as an extension of slavery. And Blyden had participated in prison strikes and rebellions. He and others saw the violence of prison as symptomatic of a societal problem where individuals are denied justice based on their class and race. They felt people shouldn't be stripped of their rights to health and dignity upon being sentenced. Instead, resources should go toward meeting people's basic needs to prevent crime in the first place. In the summer of 1971, Blyden co-founded the Attica Liberation Faction. The group compiled a manifesto and petitioned Corrections Commissioner Russell Oswald and Governor Nelson Rockefeller for better treatment. Though largely ignored, they continued organizing. After activist George Jackson was killed at a California prison, 700 men at Attica participated in a silent fast. Just weeks later, on September 9th, a spontaneous uprising began. A group of prisoners overpowered guards, sparking the Attica Rebellion. Prisoners broke windows, started fires, and captured supplies. They beat many guards. One of them, William Quinn, would die from his injuries. Soon, over 1,200 prisoners had assembled in the yard with 42 hostages, preparing to demand change. They established a medical bay, delegated men to prepare and ration food, protected and sheltered guards, and elected a negotiating committee. They appointed Blyden chief negotiator, Smith as security chief, and Barkley as a speaker. Later that day, Barkley presented their demands to the press. When his mother saw him on TV, she was terrified. He was just days from being released, but she believed authorities would want retribution. Over the next 4 days, prisoners held negotiations with officials. They called for minimum wage, rehabilitation programs, better education, and more. They promised all remaining hostages would be safe if they were given amnesty for crimes committed during the uprising. Meanwhile, Governor Rockefeller began crisis talks with President Nixon. The president told his chief of staff that the rebellion should be quelled to set an example for other Black activists. Commissioner Oswald announced he'd meet a number of the demands, but refused to guarantee amnesty. Prisoners refused to surrender. As warnings of an imminent siege mounted, they threatened to kill 8 hostages if attacked. Nevertheless, Rockefeller ordered troops to retake the prison. Helicopters tear-gassed the yard. Troopers shot over 2,000 rounds of ammunition, killing 29 prisoners and 10 guards, and wounding many others. Witnesses say troopers found Barkley and shot him in the back. Officers stripped surviving men naked, tortured them, and deprived them of medical attention. Blyden was starved for days. Smith was sexually violated, burned with cigarettes, dragged into isolation, and beaten. Directly after the attack, Governor Rockefeller thought prisoners were responsible for the deaths of the 10 guards. He called it a beautiful operation. President Nixon congratulated Rockefeller and told his chief of staff that the way to stop radicals was to kill a few. But autopsies soon confirmed that prisoners hadn't killed any guards during the attack, as threatened. Government forces had. Nixon told Rockefeller to stand his ground. Those who survived the massacre continued fighting for revolutionary change. Long after being released, Smith and Blyden campaigned for social justice and prison abolition. The demands men made at Attica in 1971 remain at the core of ongoing protests, within and beyond prison walls.
All right, so thanks for that introduction video. I'm gonna pass it over to our facilitator for this panel conversation, our New York chapter member, Alan Takal. If during the panel you have some questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A section right here in the webinar.
All right, thank you, Naima. Yeah, free the land, everybody. I'm Alan Takal. I'm a fairly long-time member of the New York chapter of MXGM, and at Queen University of New York, right? And I am super excited to be in conversation, to facilitate a conversation with these two heavy hitters, Orisanmi Burton and Lumumba Bandele. I think that everyone is going to is in for a real treat. They're in for a powerful discussion of the Long Attica Revolt, and the larger struggle of which Attica, the Attica prison uprising is just a part, right? So I'm going to introduce our two esteemed guests, and we're going to get it started. Orisanmi Burton is a husband, a father, and an assistant professor of anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C. He teaches, lectures, and conducts research in service of the Black liberation struggle. He is the author of Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. All right, so welcome, Professor Burton. Thank you for being here. And our other guest is Lumumba Bandele. Lumumba Bandele serves as the director of organizing at please help me out. AFG.
Alliance of Families for Justice. Sorry.
Alliance for Families for Justice, Families for Justice. He is a longtime organizer with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement and adjunct faculty at the CUNY School of Professional Studies, right? So, hey, welcome to both of y'all. I'm excited for this conversation. I think it'll be really, really great, right? I was told that I have a lot of questions, and so we're gonna chop it up and we're gonna jump into it. So first, I want to start with Lumumba. And Lumumba, I was wondering, can you maybe give us? I know that we had, just a little blurb, but can you kind of give us maybe a breakdown of a good breakdown of what is Black August? Right, what is Black August? Maybe give us some context for its creation, and maybe what are the tenets of Black August, and also, what's
Sure. Well, there's some direct correlation to the history and founding of Black August and this discussion we're about to have with Attica. Black August was created in the prison systems in California by the men who organized with George Jackson. And they recognized after his assassination that they needed to institutionalize not only his memory, but the legacy and vision that they collectively, I think, helped to form. They utilized the month of August as a time to train, to study, to fast, and to recommit ourselves to liberation. And I think part of what we've been able to see is the growth of Black August since its inception. We've also been able to see its power. We've seen prisons actually shudder in fear because of the discipline that people expressed in acknowledging Black August. Folks have come into the cafeteria with armbands on, some of them shaved heads, and not speaking at all, right? Literally, sending fear into the hearts of the institution itself. But we've seen it grow outside of the institution also. We've seen that many people, if you look around today, you look at some of the progressive, conscious social media handles, a lot of people are doing Black August programming. Some of them correctly, some of them incorrectly. Part of what I have to do every year is to remind people that Black August is not another Black History Month, right? There's some very distinct differences between it. We are taking this month to really focus on the freedom fighters of our liberation and how do we make sure that we position ourselves to participate in that freedom struggle within that particular kind of legacy. So we don't highlight the inventors. We don't highlight some of the other things. Those are important. Absolutely. But that's not where Black August is situated. And so we try to make that distinction. And so our Malcolm X Grassroots Movement was one of the organizations, since our founding, to really talk about this legacy and to really recommit ourselves to making sure that we not only popularize it, but we live it.
Thank you. I know that MXGM certainly, I guess, in the maybe in the 90s and the early 2000s had concerts around Black August.
And let me just say really quickly also, because I think that's how a lot of people, particularly in the hip hop community, became introduced to Black August. And, we had to remind people that it's not a concert. We actually adopted the theme to go with a charge. And let me just say this, because this is probably the perfect place to say this. I was one of the co-founders of the Black August Hip Hop Project. When we started it, we did not start it with the intention of doing a Black August event. We got the charge from two freedom fighters in exile, Nahanda Abiodun and Assata Shakur, said, look, y'all do stuff with hip hop. Y'all need to use this vehicle to raise money and awareness for our political prisoners. Cool. At that time, we were working with us. They had the whole hip journalism thing going. We had another journalist that was with us, and we decided to do what we considered to be an easy lift, which was to do a concert. And we decided to call it Black August based on the theme and the correlation to what we were doing, the charge. And so we did not intend to do a Black August event. We intended to do a hip hop event to raise awareness and consciousness and funds around political prisons that we eventually called Black August.
Wow. Okay. All right. Thank you. It's a wonderful legacy, right? Oh, and so now I want to shift over to Orisanmi. So and asks, well, maybe about, about the book, about the, this amazing book that if you have not picked it up, y'all, if you have not picked it up, then I encourage you to do that. I've seen a lot of blurbs and a lot of commentary about the book, and it is every bit as powerful as the accolades say it is. Right. So I know that's a nice setup, right? But Orisanmi, so there are a couple of, I guess, overarching themes that run through Tip of the Spear. Um, uh, One is the idea of the prison as war, right? Of the prison as war, and this general kind of theme of war in the book. And the other is of of the Long Attica Revolt, right? And so could you kind of maybe give us an idea of the general thrust of the book, right? There's a lot to unpack, right? So maybe we can begin with the title, right? Where did the title come from? Tip of the Spear. What does it mean?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Peace to everyone. Tip of the spear is military parlance for combat forces that pierce an enemy's line of defenses. So it refers to those who are at the cutting edge of a political and military struggle. And it speaks to the bravery and courage and the vulnerability of those people, but it also, I think, speaks to their unique perspective and access to valuable knowledge and intelligence, right? So I decided to use that term as the title of the book with permission when, after former political prisoner Jalil Muntakim wrote to me in a letter that political prisoners were the tip of the spear. And as I write in the book, that phrase kind of captivated me, and I started to think about it and think about what it means and think about what it could mean in the context of the prison struggle and in the context of the much longer Black liberation struggle, of which the prison struggle is a central part. And it occurred to me that it can mean different things, right? We can think about political prisoners as the tip of the spear historically, which would mean thinking about the leading role they played in advancing our movements and advancing our knowledge and advancing our struggle. But we could also think about it tactically, because again, so part of what I was trying to do in the book is to take the war analytics seriously. And the war framework, as it relates to domestic politics, isn't something that I invented or theorized. I try to show in the book that, actors on both sides of the prison struggle and of this broader struggle for Black liberation, we're always thinking about war, writing about war, thinking about strategy and tactics. And so Black August is the perfect time really to talk about this, because Black August is about nurturing our revolutionary history, reconnecting to our revolutionary history and imagination. So the war framework is always there, but sometimes people use it as though it's a euphemism or as though it's metaphorical. So my goal was really to take it really seriously and to think about strategy and tactics on both sides of the struggle. So the other ways you could think about tip of the spear is that the idea that imprisoned people are materially and structurally located in such close proximity to the citadels of state power that their movements and their rebellions have enormous consequences for the state and for other liberation struggles. This is similar to how George Jackson was talking about the prison movement and the ways in which the prison movement has an opportunity to strike at the prestige of the state. But there's another way to think about it, because in war, everything is reversible. One person's advantage can be turned suddenly into a disadvantage. So you have to think about things dynamically. And so if you think about tip of the spear, political prisoners as the tip of the spear from the perspective of the state, then that would mean that our political prisoners are the tip, not of a revolutionary spear, but of a counterinsurgency spear that's really targeting all of us in the so-called free world. And that prisons are then a strategy to manage and control us, we who are on the outside, we who think of ourselves as free. So tip of the spear, that term is operating on those three registers all the time.
That I appreciate that. I know that even in my own teaching, the how difficult it is to get students to be that tender that this talk of war is not just a metaphor, that this is real, right? And that not only did these revolutionaries understand it to be that, but that the state understood it to be a war, not just against revolutionaries, but against these colonized people who are grabbing at the gates and trying to liberate themselves, right? So I also wanted to ask about and maybe both of y'all can speak on this, but about this idea of the Long Attica Revolt, right? That even though the conversation is kind of focused on Attica, and of course we kind of, I guess, commemorate the anniversary in a few days or whatnot. Attica was just a part of a much larger kind of prison rebellion, prison organizing kind of movement, right? And so I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the law, and also, of course, Lumumba also.
Sure. I mean, part of what I tried to do in the book was just to intervene into how we remember Attica and to place it squarely within the Black radical tradition and the long history of Black revolutionary struggle, right? And I think this really relates to what Lumumba was talking about in terms of this isn't Black. Because a lot of the incarcerated people who were very involved in the formation of Black August early on would talk about the extent to which Black History Month had been co-opted. And some of the radicalism that is inherent in it. And I think that that's also true of the way that we remember Attica. And I think, so I want to be careful here. I think there's lots of different ways to narrate the story, right? And I'm not saying that this way is right and the other wrong. I do think historically, a lot of people who were deeply involved in Attica had very good reasons to de-emphasize its revolutionary character, because for them it was a matter of survival, because many of them were under state surveillance and any number of other things, right? 50 years have passed, and I thought that it was actually really important that we resituate Attica back within a kind of revolutionary genealogy. And part of what that means is refusing the terms of the state's narration of what Attica was. Attica Revolt is a term that I came up with to name something that the brothers and sisters I was interviewing were already talking about, which is the fact that I would sit down with someone and I would interview them about Attica, and they would start talking about the Auburn Rebellion, which is a rebellion that preceded Attica. I would talk to brothers about Attica, and they would talk about the rebellions in the New York City jail system, or they would talk about the Panther 21, or they would talk about George Jackson, or they would talk about the Haitian Revolution. So then in terms of our Black radical imagination, only focusing on Attica as though it was a unique incident, and in some ways it was, but in a lot of other ways it wasn't, actually incarcerates our Black radical imagination. So I was trying to open that up. And so the Long Attica Revolt refers to this protracted period of struggle within and against the prison system that culminates in Attica, but doesn't begin in Attica. You know, the first rebellion that I talk about in the book happened in the Tombs in the New York City jail system on August 10th. So technically, Attica fits within Black August in the way that all of the different rebellions in August are remembered. It culminates in Attica. And part of the problem that I've also noticed in the way that Attica remembered is that so often when people talk about Attica, the first thing they talk about is the repression. the first thing they talk about is the brutality with which Attica was repressed. And that is something we should talk about, right? But what does it mean that we place more emphasis on how our revolutionary movements were crushed than we do on the actual content of those movements and what they can teach us and what they have to offer us and what they mean for us? And so that's another thing I was trying to do, is to really play close attention to what were the demands and desires of people who were at the front of this movement. And part of how Attica gets co-opted is we're led to believe that Attica was, the aspirations of those who led that movement were only about making prisons more livable. And of course, that was the key thing that they wanted, right? Of course it was. But they were thinking about decolonization. They were thinking about revolutionary transformation. They were thinking about internationalism. Their aspirations were not incarcerated by the prison. And the fact that that is the dominant way of understanding Attica is actually the result of a very intentional propaganda campaign. And so part of what I try to do in the book is make that sort of visible, right? But, you know, and the last thing I'll say is just, you know, I call it the Long Attica Revolt because it's focused on the prisons and it culminates in Attica, but really, I would argue that that's kind of an arbitrary demarcation, and we could have just as easily started the book, you know, with the Haitian Revolution. Like I'm taking seriously the idea that Attica is part of a protracted, long struggle. I hear my daughter crying, so that's a good time to stop.
Word, I appreciate that, man. On Lumumba, yeah.
No, I just wanted to say, first of all, amen, Ashe. I mean, totally on point. And I think part of what, you know, I understand this dynamic of Attica to be is that Attica was a reflection of the time. You know, the world was undergoing revolution, you know, not only, you know, in the United States in terms of the revolutionary movements that were active, but we're talking about around the world. And people who were incarcerated were getting that information and their lives were being transformed. And so it wasn't as if this stuff was happening on the outside and then this uprising happened and people were instantaneously politicized or activated. It wasn't that. It was like, it was all of these seeds that were being planted, and then people began to activate themselves after all of this. So I think, you know, it's important to look at, and we'll talk about this later, you know, those dynamics, because we're looking at some of those dynamics today.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Now, I mean, because of the maybe the nature of this conversation, I don't want to as Ori just kind of pushed back on, I don't want to isolate Attica from its larger context, but I do want to spend maybe a little bit of time talking about the revolt itself, right? Maybe what, you know, maybe y'all could say a little bit about the specific conditions that that sparked the revolt itself within the prison, and also you know, what the rebellion looked like, right? What lengths did the state go to crush the rebellion? And also one thing that I'm really interested in is this idea of that you write about, the idea of the Attica Commune, right? Like how did the captives organize themselves, and what did that look like, and what were they thinking, if you will, in that moment? How were they thinking about their struggle in that moment?
Sure. So the question of conditions, you know, is really interesting. You typically, when about conditions, ask about prison conditions. You know, they're asking about how aggressive and oppressive Attica was, and of course it was, and it still is. And it's hard to put into words. A lot of it was in the video in terms of the specifics, right? The specific ways, right? But let me just say that the brothers who talked about it, the brothers who lived it, right, talked about it in terms of warfare. They talked about it in terms of slavery. They talked about it in terms of fascism, and they talked about it in terms of genocide. So we should take those things seriously, right? So that's the vocabulary that they produced to talk about what Attica was like, right? There was an Attica brother named Jomo Omowale who tells a story about how he was put into solitary confinement, which is a form of torture, right, for piercing his nose. And the write-up it was that he damaged state property by piercing his own nose, right? So I think that tells you a lot, right, about about the whole atmosphere, right? Terms like slavery and war and genocide aren't euphemisms, right? But again, if we're talking about war, then that I think changes our vocabulary, because when you talk about conditions in war, you're actually not just talking about material conditions, you're talking about, the weather, the population, the level of education, the level of political organization. So all of these are the conditions. And this gets to what Lumumba was just talking about the fact that contrary to how it's often narrated, they weren't just inert victims of the prison system. Like, a lot of these people were organizing, they were very serious, they were very connected to movements on the outside, and they were thinking about revolution and trying to operationalize and put their behavior in alignment with those thoughts. And then, the national conditions, COINTELPRO, the war on drugs, deindustrialization, all of these things are happening, and the international conditions. The two other things I'll say in terms of conditions is that the Black radical analytic of prisons at the time was not that prisons are something separate from the outside world, but rather that prisons are a microcosm of the broader world. That in prison, you can see an intensified form of what the actual world is like. And so the things, if you really look at it, the things that people in Attica were demanding are not fundamentally different from what people in the so-called free world were demanding. The level of intensity was different. The repression was more concentrated and intense. But people on the outside were asking for better education, better housing, all the same things. And so I think this destabilizes this idea of prison conditions a little bit. I can say more, but I wanted to give Brother Lumumba a chance to jump in, and then maybe we can talk about the commune.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly, I think, as folks on the outside were organizing to declare and affirm their human rights, that's basically what the brothers inside were doing. LD is quoted as saying, we are not men, we are not beasts, and we not intend to be driven as such. Essentially, we are human beings. We did not drop off our humanity when we walked through the gates of Attica. We remain human beings, and we expect to be acknowledged as such. And I think even for the smaller population who may have found themselves in places where they were not getting politicized, they were not doing all of this, I think some of the other conditions did move them to action. Whether it moved them to another level of political growth is something else. But when you are given a roll of toilet paper that's supposed to last a month, when you're given toothpaste that's supposed to last a month, right? When you are beaten severely on a regular, right? And you have no ability to hold anyone accountable to that, right? When you are not allowed access to educational programs, all of these things, right? And just to be clear, this was system-wide throughout not just New York State prisons, but throughout prisons in general. But Attica had a very specific and almost distinct kind of way in which it showed up that surprised people, that it seemed almost like ultra Jim Crow-ish. It was Southern folks, almost Southern crackerish to some degree, right? And I think it really moved people, particularly those on the outside who were surprised to hear of these particular conditions, to be able to say, well, damn, what is everyday, life like in this particular prison if this moved people to do, these kinds of things. So I didn't want to gloss over like some of the things that actually were real, like daily things that people had to deal with. And people were literally, suffering from health conditions, but they were not able to access basic health care. And again, in the context of warfare, right, your enemy is not going to provide you any kind of health care, right? But in the context of legality, you have to raise the contradictions. If I am supposed to be in the custody of the state, why then are you not allowing me access to quality health care?
But I think that's actually perfect. So I'm going to say just kind of to my ear, I'm hearing maybe two different strands. I'm going to bring in the word abolition, right? For on one level, with the commune, I'm wondering about or you use this wonderful phrase. I'm not sure if you were the first to use it, but of abolitionist world making, right? In to talk about the kind of the transformation of the prison yard, right, into this maybe kind of liberated space, right? But then also, and so that's one kind of maybe perspective on abolition, but then it's also maybe there's also the Shut Down Attica campaign that that Lumumba is a part of, that that kind of that foregrounds human rights, right? And how prisoners are being treated by the state and better conditions and things like that, right? But to the point of shutting down shutting down Attica itself, right? So I was wondering maybe if y'all could both of y'all could speak to maybe those two different maybe valences of abolition.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they are necessarily two different valences of abolition, but what you're pointing out definitely is a contradiction that's inherent in a lot of revolutionary movements, and that's a part of the Black liberation struggle, right? On the one hand, this struggle to force the state to live up to its pledges, which is, to be clear, a necessary precondition for the survival of colonized people under genocide, right? I mean, if we're living under conditions of genocide, then yes, we need to fight to ameliorate our immediate conditions. Also, even those who have a revolutionary and abolitionist platform, like, it's not like you can just snap your fingers and create revolution out of nowhere. So there has to be a process where you can build communities of struggle together around specific campaigns. And so, I mean, all of those things are present. All of those contradictions are present. What I wanted to do was to give us an opportunity to just step outside for a moment of the pragmatic concerns that often movements are forced into by virtue of just how they're situated within the sort of landscape of struggle, and to give us a moment to really just behold the creative genius that the brothers in Attica produced among themselves, as a way to really meditate on the fact that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, in order to meditate on the power of political education and organization, in order to meditate on the fact that abolition has happened before in a geographically and temporally limited scale. But the argument is that in those 5 days where the brothers controlled the prison, that actually was abolition, it's a template and a genealogy of abolition, insofar as they expelled the forces of state violence from a discrete and distinct geography. And then, so that's the negative part of abolition, not negative in a moral sense, but negative in an objective sense, the destructive part, right? And then within that space, and the brothers who were there talk about how initially it was pandemonium. There was no organization. So that could have been the end of it. It could have just descended into an internal race riot or whatever, that anything could have happened. But they had the collective genius to understand that within that space, they had an opportunity to create something new. And that's what they did. So they created a whole new system for solving problems. They created a system for taking care of each other. They created a system for security, which was not identical to the forms of security that the state had employed, right? They talk about what their security really meant. Their security was about ensuring the integrity of the rebellion and promoting its ethics and ensuring that people weren't taken advantage of. They developed all these forms of care. They took time to like gaze at the stars. They took long walks. They sang songs, right? Like and then they talked about it, right? Like Big Black has this long paragraph, this long statement where he talks about what it felt like in that moment. And he was like, it felt liberated. Like I was free. Like I know what it feels like. I know what it tastes like. I know what it sounds like. And so I wanted us to just have a minute to soak all of that up. And yeah, so yeah, but those contradictions are there, and I didn't want to gloss over those either. And I don't think they necessarily have to be antagonistic contradictions, although sometimes they were. And I should also say that on the flip side of this, there were some revolutionaries in Attica who talked often about the productivity of the intensity of the repression in Attica because it helped people to demystify what the world was really like. The fact that things were so bad, it demystified the fact always at war. This is I talked about being manufacturing drove in Attica, in Bedford Hills, in San Quentin, right? So there's the other side of conditions. So I'll leave it there.
That is so dope. Hold on, I'm getting the, well, I got the 4-minute warning like 6 minutes ago, but I wanted to Lumumba, I was wondering if you could say more about the Shut Down Attica campaign.
Sure. I'll say this, and I'll just to dovetail a little bit on what was said. I think I use this idea of what happened in those 5 days on the yard in my organizing class, because that is a great example of how people utilize the moment, their own creativity, imagination, resources, and skills to actively jump into action. People think that organizers are born. People think that, people have automatically this kind of thing. No, people respond to the moment, and these brothers did. So we have created the Alliance of Families for Justice since its inception has been committed to the closing of Attica. The campaign stands on 2 basic pillars. One is that after 1971, Attica should have been closed immediately, full stop, right? The fact that 43 people lost their lives, the fact that the state was responsible for this, they lied about it, and then continued to maintain some of those conditions was more than enough for the state to be closed down. I want to say this really quickly because in that little clip we heard about the governor and his role in actually ordering the takeover. Well, 3 years before this, when City College was taken over by the students, the governor put the same mandate to the president of City College that said that you need to call in the police right now and retake the campus by force. The president resigned because he refused to do so. He understood what that would have meant. So here we go 3 years later, and Attica happens. So Attica, to some extent, could have actually happened in City College's campus, right? Because this governor, I want us to name, Nelson Rockefeller was the governor at that time, was really clear about state power and how he wanted to utilize it. So at AFJ, we understand that Attica should be closed. And then the other pillar is that not much has changed. In fact, not enough has changed. We know today, based on people who are still there, people who have left most recently, and this is one example. When the Buffalo Bills lose a game, people in Attica are beaten by the guards. When the Buffalo Bills lose a game, people in Attica prepare to be in this kind of heightened conflict relationship with the guards, right? So we know that the conditions still have not changed. The beatings still happen. We know that the healthcare is still atrocious. We know that the access to programs is still atrocious. And we just had a conversation with the state senator, Julie Salazar, who is the chair of the Committee of Corrections. And they're looking into the fact that there are people who have not been convicted of crimes yet, coming out of some counties like Monroe County who are being held in Attica. Right, so the legality of that is still being questioned. So we have a whole series of things, and we are inviting everybody to join the campaign to close Attica. And I always say that the lives of the 43 people that were taken on that day, September 13th, some actually died later from the wounds, but that gives us a mandate, right? Their lives are a mandate. Their deaths are a mandate. We have to make sure Attica is shut down.
Wow, thank you for that. I know that we're running a little bit short on time, but I do want to take some invite some questions from our Zoom audience. Let's see, are there any questions? Let's see, y'all. We have maybe time for maybe 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, we've got one question in the chat. This one is for Ori specifically. How does your book address the international implications of the psychological torture experienced by the prisoners, particularly in relation to the challenges of de-radicalizing communities?
Yeah, peace. Sorry about that. My internet dropped off for a minute there. It's a hard question to answer. There's different layers to it. I'm still researching the sort of implications, but I guess what I can say is that a lot of what the book tries to do is to show the extent to which actors, state and non-state actors at various levels, inside and outside of government, including academia, were involved in a coordinated campaign of counterinsurgency against the Black liberation struggle in the US, in prisons, and that these same actors were also involved in global theaters of counterinsurgency, so like psychologists and psychiatrists and others at universities like Cornell and universities in Canada and elsewhere, descending upon US prisons to experiment specifically on the Black revolutionary militant minority, to figure out why to figure that out, with the explicit purpose of using that knowledge to help manage radicalism outside of prison walls. So again, it's not just about what's happening in prisons, but they're thinking about prisons as a laboratory for how to manage resistance. Yes, Baba Mutulu Shakur wrote about this quite a bit. He's got a co-authored essay on behavior modification as counterinsurgency, and it's cited in the book, and a lot of what he wrote I used as a jumping off point, and a lot of what he wrote was right. A lot of what he wrote about that was right. So most def.
Wow, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay. Okay, I'll just read it. What would you gather the prison movement's charge to broader abolition movement for doing this work? Movement's charge to the broader abolition movement for doing this work.
I mean, I think a lot about, well, first of all, a lot of people don't understand the Black revolutionary genealogy of the prison abolition movement. Like, I get a lot of students who just assume that abolition was thought up by academics in a library somewhere. And I think it's easy to think that. But what would it mean to reconnect it to a Black revolutionary genealogy? So, for instance, George Jackson talks about the prison as an institution that serves the need of the totalitarian state. And it does this by eliminating, isolating, and liquidating the protagonists of radical liberation struggles. And he argued that dysfunction of the prison needed to be completely destroyed. And so I would make a distinction between Attica the prison and Attica the function, because I think that we need to shut down Attica for a whole host of reasons. And we also need to seize the narrative about how this happened and how the campaign fits into a larger, more ambitious set of demands around the nature of our society. Because if we don't, the state will seize the narrative and make it seem as though they shut down Attica because, you know, a page in history has been turned, right? But you know, this question of thinking really specifically about prisons as serving a counter-revolutionary function and the way in which, and we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but oftentimes the state manages to turn what we think of as our victories into techniques of our further repression and pacification. And so, you know, I guess that wasn't a great answer, but I'll leave it there because I know we're short on time. But I think reading Black revolutionaries who were fighting within and against the prison as the progenitors of abolition, reading Harriet Tubman as a progenitor of abolition, thinking about their militancy and their courage as what would be required to actually achieve that kind of a demand.
I so appreciate this, and yeah, there is so much that I wanted to get to and that we're not going to get to tonight, but that's okay, because there will be more opportunities for folks to talk. Orisanmi and Lumumba, I really appreciate that. We appreciate y'all's presence and wisdom and engagement in the struggle and your service to the struggle, right? So yeah, thank y'all so much, right? I guess I'm gonna go ahead and transition, because of course there are things that folks can do, right? That you can engage in right now that to further this struggle, right? So Naima.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Ori. Thank you, Lumumba, Baba. So now we're going to talk about some calls to action really quickly. So we've learned a lot about Attica today. So there are a few links that I'll be putting in the chat right now. The first one is to submit your own Attica story to help to shut down the Attica prison, to sign the campaign to get us to those numbers, and to donate to the Attica Brothers Foundation as well. There will also be a lot of links for the political prisoner campaigns that we work on being put in the chat to help free Imam Jamil Al-Amin, Kamal Siddiqui, Mumia Abu Jamal, Reverend Joy Powell, as well as some welcome home donations for Brother Veranza Bowers, who we're very lucky to have home and out of prison. There'll also be the Black August handbook in the chat if folks want to get more information about this month and why we commemorate, not celebrate, Black August. And also, please join us. We will have September new member or Saturdays on the chat. If you want to get down with MXGM, now's the time to do it and be down to help us organize next Black August next year. Thank everybody for coming on today, for asking questions and engaging in this conversation with us. It was really powerful and incredible. That's all that we have for today. So in MXGM, we say, what's the call? And the response is, bring them all. Thank you. Have a good one, everybody. Peace.
Peace.
Peace, everybody.